interpretación y ahí pueden entrar en su canal de idioma preferido. Se va a ver como el lado izquierdo de la pantalla si están ingresando la llamada por computadora y cuando seleccionen el botón de interpretación pueden seleccionar su idioma preferido como el español. Así todo lo que se diga en inglés lo van a poder escuchar a través del canal de español para la interpretación. Si están ingresando la llamada por teléfono inteligente, se va a ver como lado derecho de la pantalla y van a poder abrir el menú en los 3 puntitos, seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y después seleccionar español. Así todo lo que se diga, lo que usted diga en español se va a interpretar en inglés y viceversa, lo que digan en inglés se va a interpretar al español. Déjenos saber si necesitan ayuda o tienen problemas haciendo la interpretación y les podemos ayudar. Nada más dejen un mensaje en el chat y les responderemos. And please let us know if you have any issues accessing today's interpretation function. You can drop a message in the chat and we'll be glad to help you out. Thank you all so much for creating a bilingual space today. Muchas gracias por crear un espacio bilingüe hoy.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for We Are's virtual panel, Critical Race Parenting and Transracial Adoption, Affirming Identity and Informing Families. I am Brittany Del Rosario. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the Children and Families Program Coordinator with We Are. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from this evening. We Are stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education and is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides anti-racism training for children, families, and educators. We use a three-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education by offering summer camps for children in rising 1st through 5th grade, professional development for educators, and workshops for parents and families. Our purpose for this evening is to bring together families and community and our community to be in conversation about critical race parenting as it relates to what it means to embody a healthy, identity-affirming home for our children of color, especially when they have one or more caregivers that identify as white. Many of the We Are families, as well as families in Durham, identify as transracially adopted households. With this in mind, we have seen a growing need for information, connection, and community support around helping our children to continue to develop healthy racial identities when their parents may not reflect their own birth identity. Before we begin that discussion, we would like to invite all of you to join us in a native land acknowledgement. In a moment, one of my colleagues will drop a link into the chat and on our respective streaming sites. Before we begin any work this evening, we must bring attention to the fact that we're living and learning on stolen land. I invite you to head to the website, insert your location, and copy and paste the native tribes that once cared for the land you are currently on. To name those native tribes is to keep them alive and in the present. We must do everything we can to ensure that their history and their current existence isn't erased. So please feel free to head to that link. And thank you to those of you that have already dropped those names into the chat. All right. Thank you to those of you that are continuing to add those names to the chat. And if we can get that link dropped one more time, that would be great. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Please continue to utilize the chat throughout this evening to make comments or ask questions. As a way to get us started, I'd like to share a story from the community that highlights one of the very real reasons that we need to continue to do this work and why these conversations are so important. So the following is being shared with permission. This is not my own personal story, but this is a story from the community. I hosted a parenting across racial lines support group for white parents. At the time, I was a teacher, and the parents were all white adoptive parents of children of color who attended either the school I was working at or a nearby school. I was the only birth parent in the group. Everyone else was adoptive. The idea was to support these parents to be more aware of what it means to parent a child of a different race, especially if the parent is white. There's a lot to learn and change. In my experience of those mostly wealthy white parents, they seemed stressed when their children wanted to hang out with children from other racial groups. For example, their Black friends. It was clear that many of these parents did not have a community or a group of friends of other races, and it scared them that their child might not identify with their own family's culture. Lots of outdated thinking was expressed, such as "I'm colorblind and I don't see color." Parents would share how they encourage their adoptive children of color to socialize with more acceptable white kids. Ultimately, the parents were not interested in learning about being racially just and about dismantling the racism inside themselves and their families. I'd like us to hold that story with us as we venture into tonight's topic. And I'd also like you to recall any experiences or stories you have about racial harm as it pertains, to transracial adoption. If you would like to share those stories with We Are, please use the story collection form that should be dropped in the chat, will be dropped in the chat throughout the evening. An option to remain anonymous is available on the form, and we would never use anyone's story without permission. Love is important when it comes to parenting all children, but it isn't the only thing that matters when trying to raise whole beings. I'd like to pass the mic now to We Are's lead curator, Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock, for more context on this evening's topic. Dr. Bullock.
All right, I'm waiting for, I think, there we go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for what we feel is a very important and timely event and conversation for us to be having. I am Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock, the co-founder and lead curator here at We Are, also known as executive director. I am a critical race scholar, and I do critical whiteness studies specifically, and I study white children's racial identity construction. And I bring that into this space because I do think that that perspective is important as I share and engage in this conversation with you all and try to situate us in a little bit of context. Many of you know, and some of you are former participants and attendees of our anti-racism summer camp that we have been hosting since 2016. In Durham, and we've now, scaled up, and we have 2 camps that we offer in Greensboro as well. Over the years, we have noticed some patterns, and so part of having this conversation on transracial adoption is about some of the patterns that we've noticed in the attendees at our We Are summer camp. And for those that don't know, we host this camp for kids in rising 1st through 5th grade. So the purpose of us having this conversation and this panel is because what we've noticed over the years is that white families who adopt Black children have become the 4th largest demographic in our summer camps. That is starting with Black children, then white children, then biracial children, and then children of transracially adopted families. I'm going to speak a little bit slower, and I encourage our panelists to, as we have interpretation here. I have a tendency to get excited and go fast, so I'm going to slow down, and that's the intentional reason for why I'm slowing down. Now, we only get to see a snapshot of these families. We only have them for 5 days. And, without making sweeping judgment or generalizations about these families, right? Because we just have a snapshot. We have seen some healthy examples of transracial adoption parenting. And then unfortunately, we've seen some unhealthy examples. And so because we were wondering what to do with this. And so we wanted to host this panel to bring this conversation to light and make and normalize this kind of conversation. And so when I talk about some healthy and some unhealthy, you know, I think it's very good to have some examples. So here's just two quick ones. So for example, for healthy, like we had one set of parents, white parents who adopted a young Black girl. They found a Black hairstylist to do their daughter's hair. And she came to camp with her braids and her beads. And she was very proud and affirming in the presentation of her hair and just being in our anti-racism, you know, summer camp space. And then we've seen some examples of where, again, not, you know, we don't want to make theorize what's happening in the home, but it would appear that for that week at camp, one Black girl's hair wasn't the priority for that week. So I'm being very careful for how I describe what was happening with this child. And by that, I mean, the child's hair was noticeably not well cared for, at least in that week. And so this child asked one of our Black counselors to make her hair look like the Black counselor's hair, right? We've also had an example of where a white parent told us that their Black child attending our camp was the first time they'd been around Black people in a long time. Right, so we're hearing multiple stories like this, well-intentioned, but we also know that impact is greater than our intent. And so we're carrying these stories. And it's been a lot to observe over these years. And also, at least locally here in Durham, and I imagine this is other places as well, there's been an uptick in transracial adoption involving Black children. And so we were looking at what is our role and responsibility in witnessing that and being a part of it, and also having parents reaching out to us in hopes that our 1 week could be more transformative. The expectations for what we could do in that 1 week were greater than what we could realistically do to support the families, right? And so we do want to be very clear as I begin to pass the mic to Brittany, is that please note that this is not an event promoting transracial adoption. So we're not here to advertise and this is how you do it. We're not here to promote this. We're here to create this learning opportunity in this space, that if this phenomenon is happening beyond our control, then how can we be a part of bringing intentionality, bringing a critical race parenting lens to the table, so that if this is something that white parents are doing, we're creating an educational space to be very thoughtful and to make sure this is the right thing that I should be doing in my family. Right, and inviting other cultures. This is not just Black children that are being transracially adopted. That's just has been our experience in camp. There's other, transcultural adoptions as well that occur. And we would just want to be our most thoughtful selves. And let's think very critically before we do this. I'm going to share two quick things, and I'm going to pass the mic to Brittany. And that is because some of you might have been thinking, what is critical race parenting? And actually, I've never heard of it before. So just real quick, this is not the dissertation version. This is the quick and dirty. And I hope that you continue and further your learning beyond this session, right? So just quick and dirty. And this is from Christine DePau and Cheryl Matias. And they define critical race parenting as thinking about and focusing on the relationships of teaching and learning in historical, social, and institutional context, like you're parenting, understanding this is a teaching and learning relationship. And as parents, you're focused on healthy identity development. That has to be a part of critical race parenting. Thinking about resilience, and we can challenge that word a little bit. I'm not necessarily a fan of it, and thinking about kids of color. And then action toward the elimination of racism and other systems of oppression. This type of mindset and framework has to be present in your parenting, right? In the parenting, that's where we want this to be present. And then I just have one quote for you all, also from the article that Christine DePauw wrote and Cheryl Matias. They're quoted as saying, a critical race perspective on parenting includes a critical analysis of systems of oppression, including institutional racism, and is embedded within the lived experiences, knowledge systems, values, and pedagogies of families and communities of color. So as you're bringing a critical race, and we're advocating that if you're going to do this, to having a critical race parent perspective, you have to be connected to families of color. You have to understand systems of oppression and have that a part of how you are thinking about and raising children. So with that, I'm going to pause because we have a great panel of folks here. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat because we will have some time for Q&A at the end. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Brittany Del Rosario.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock. I'd now like to have our panelists introduce themselves. Dr. Williams, would you start us off?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Cherish Williams. I am a licensed psychologist, and I specialize in racial identity development and also, anxiety, depression, things like that, working with children and adolescents as well as their families. Yeah, I'm a board member as well of We Are. I'm very happy to be here and
thank you.
ready to share some knowledge.
Thank you. And I do apologize, my internet connection is very unstable, so I apologize if I freeze up a lot. Brooks, would you mind going next?
Sure, can y'all hear me? Yes, okay. I'm Brooks Rainey Pearson. I'm an attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and I'm a foster and adoptive mom. I started fostering in Durham County in 2017. On the very first day I got my license, a 5-year-old Black boy was put in my care, and my partner and I had crazy misconceptions about foster care. We thought we're going to go into this and support the whole family and provide a place for the child while the grown-ups figure out what they need to fix, and then there will be this reunification. And we didn't understand how incredibly difficult it is to get your children back once they're in the foster system. So we rooted for his biological family, but their parental rights were ultimately terminated. And last September, after having him for almost 5 years, we adopted DeMarte. He is 10 now. I think transracial adoption can be incredibly problematic. I often question being culpable in this, but the foster system is anything but ideal. In an ideal world, he would be raised by a Black family, but our choice was either to adopt him or put him back in the foster system, and we never, ever, ever, ever would have done that. So we're making the best of a less than ideal situation and working hard to minimize any detrimental effects of being raised in a white family. We have a good relationship with his first family, and he spends every weekend with his biological brother. And we love him fiercely, but we know that love is not enough. We've fostered other children, many other children, and every child who's come through our house has been Black or Latinx, and the system is structurally racist. So I'm leaning into my own discomfort to learn everything I can about how to raise the children in our care with a strong sense of self. And I'm so grateful for Rhonda and for We Are. And the first time I filled out that camp application, I think I maxed out the number of words because I knew I needed so much help and how important this was. But she's right, it takes more than a week. We have to build up a lot more support than that. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to keep learning and keep doing better. And I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Brooks. Thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, Heather.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm excited to be here. My name is Heather, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a transracial adoptee myself, and I was adopted from South Korea back in the 70s when there were not a lot of resources for parents adopting transracially, let alone from across the ocean. I live in Orange County, so here in North Carolina. I'm I do a lot of community organizing, activism, anti-racism activism. I would say that I grew up in a very healthy home with amazing parents. And yet I have very strong feelings about adoption, about transracial adoption. So I think even under the best circumstances, it is a very tricky road to navigate. It's ongoing. A lot of adoptees, I feel like, are coming out of, we often say like an adoptee fog or adoption fog sort of later in life when pieces are starting to click together. And so this evening, as I speak, I can only speak as to my own personal experience as someone adopted from a different country and as an Asian American adoptee. Certainly, I don't know what it's like to be in other situations, but I feel like there's a lot of overlap and a lot that we can share, that I think very shared experiences. So hopefully my perspective is something that families find to be useful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you to all three of you for being here this evening and for sharing everything that I know you all are going to share with us. I am going to, for the time being, have my camera off just because my internet is very shaky and I want to make sure that I am still here with you all. And I know that the camera sometimes pulls a lot of that energy. So we are going to go ahead and jump right into our first question. So this question is for all our panelists, but I will kind of be putting you in a particular order here. So our first question: what does a healthy, identity-affirming home environment embody? So what does a healthy, identity-affirming home environment embody? And Dr. Williams, we'd like you to get us started with that.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, one of the keys to having a healthy identity-affirming home environment is understanding, as well as openness, right? And so there has to be like a willingness to discuss and also understanding if there isn't a willingness to discuss for your child. And so recognizing that, acknowledging as well as accepting that there's difference in between, like, racial differences and acknowledging that. So it's not something that is like kind of hidden underneath the table, or, we're putting a blanket over or making it seem as if it doesn't exist. I believe someone mentioned being colorblind earlier. And so if we're, wanting to kind of if we're wanting to create more of a healthy environment, we're also wanting to recognize that we as humans evolve, and as we evolve, our interests are going to evolve as well. Our knowledge is going to evolve. And so for your child, especially, your child who has a different racial background as you, then be willing to explore, or at least allow your child to be open to exploring different parts about their identity, and recognize too, when you may need to step aside or seek help, right? And so be okay with that. Recognize that that is okay if your child is not looking for you to help them with their identity, and to explore it, that's not a jab to who you are as a parent, but just allowing them to feel affirmed in that, and to not feel as if they need permission from their parents if they're going to hurt, their parents' feelings, especially as a white parent raising a Black child, is not going to hurt your feelings by not wanting your help, or for asking for assistance from someone maybe who looks like them, right? If there are certain questions that they feel a little bit more comfortable being able to ask someone else, be okay with stepping aside, and be okay with asking for help for your child if they're asking for that, like seeking that for them, and not feeling as if it's something that's threatening who you are as a parent, or that they're not, recognizing or appreciating anything within your environment. I think those things are going to be really helpful in being able to create that healthy environment, as well as affirming identities at home.
Thank you so much for that. There were so many good points that just resonated with me as a parent myself, not a parent, not not a white parent of children of color, but definitely as a parent, that exploration, that allowing your child to explore, I mean, that should come as a parent anyway, and then adding that extra layer of, hey, like, let's have someone else be able to explain whatever it is that they need, because it is ultimately what they need. And as a parent, if you want to advocate for your child, that is the best support that they can get. Thank you so much for that. Heather, would you like to add any thoughts here?
Sure. I'd like to echo what Dr. Williams said about not pretending to be colorblind, because that's impossible and it's very unhealthy. Because the fact is, your child is a child of color, and ignoring that part of them is really ignoring their whole identity, and that's going to lead to a very toxic environment. I would say in terms of generating and cultivating a healthy identity affirming home, it's important to remember that, if your child comes to your family at a very young age, if you don't talk about race and racial identity, they will likely identify as white, unless they are deliberately around other people that look like them, unless you talk about their culture and you foster a healthy sense of identity. Otherwise, they will probably, and again, this is just my experience, and I've seen this at least with a lot of Asian American adoptees, they grow up with white identities. And that's really hard to change after decades of that. So I would say talk about race early, talk about race often. Don't be afraid of it. It's also possible to replicate white supremacy in the family. If you function as a white family, then you are replicating white supremacy within that family. If you censor the culture that you are bringing into the family and make that a part of your identity yourself, you definitely don't want to co-opt that culture. But you're not a white family. You're a family with members who are not white and are going to have different experiences. So keep in mind that white supremacy can manifest within the family, even with good intentions. I would also echo what Dr. Williams says about asking for help, recognizing that you're gonna, make mistakes, and also recognizing that each kid is different. So, you may have one adopted child that wants to talk about race and where they came from all the time, and then you may be like me, where my parents were both white. My mom would bring home Asian dolls and Asian this and Asian that. And I was like, I don't, I just want what my other friends have. But I did not have a lot of Asian friends. And so I wanted what my white friends had. And so even with good intentions, your kids may not really accept that. And so I think it's really healthy to honor sort of where they are with their identity, but be available. Make sure that they know that it's okay to come ask questions and talk and be confused. And that their identity formation may ebb and flow, and just to kind of move along with them as they're undergoing that process. I also think that it's really important to remember that it may be a wonderful, happy occasion for you to bring a child into your family, and it is, but adoption is inextricably linked to trauma, and that trauma is going to be ongoing. And then you add in the interracial element, and it's just, this wonderful world of confusion and trauma, but it's also can be very beautiful. So it's something that the whole family has to be in together. So.
Right, definitely. Thank you so much, Heather. And I think that my takeaway from what you said was that idea of not erasing who they are, not erasing their culture, their skin color, anything about them, not throwing it in their face, surely, but definitely not erasing it if it comes up, if they have questions about it. So that very much spoke to me. And Brooks, did you like to weigh in here?
Sure. My co-panelists have so many good thoughts. So glad to be part of this. So when I think of identity affirming house, of course, you think, oh, you want to have dolls and books and toys and artwork that reflects their identity. And of course you do. but that's just a tiny piece of it. You need to have real live people who reflect their identity. It's important for their racial identity development to have frequent contact with people of their own race or ethnicity. So when we moved houses a few years ago, we looked for a racially diverse neighborhood, which was way harder to find than it should be. But we did. And so they do have Black and biracial friends in our neighborhood. You need to look for a racially diverse school. My kids have a Black pediatrician. We have Black friends who visit our house and hang out with us. And we seek out opportunities for them to be in groups with only other Black children. Durham Public Schools has a great program called We Are Kings, which is a leadership program for boys of color to assist with healthy identity development. And it has a real social justice bent. And our son loves it because once a week he gets to spend the afternoon in an all Black space. We talk a lot about identity and culture and race in our house. We have lots of photographs of their biological families around our house, and we make sure to talk about them and talk about the part of their lives that they lived with them, because we don't get our children as infants. As a foster family, we actually don't foster infants. The youngest we've ever had was 2, and we've had teenagers, and you need to talk about that part of their lives, because even though I didn't live it, it's very much a part of their identity. We also want to make sure that they know that although they belonged there, they also belong here. We do nightly affirmations. We say you are good, you are kind, you are brave, you are strong, you are safe. We say you belong here and we love you. So that they have a sense of belonging, even though we all look different.
Yes, definitely intentionally finding those spaces where they feel as though they belong, and also reminding them that they belong in in the space you've created with them, right? As well. I think that's so important for them to, understand that they belong everywhere, right? Like they're allowed to be and should be able to exist in every space. And so we're going to go ahead and go to our next question, but thank you for those thoughtful responses. So Dr. Williams, this next question is for you. In working with families, what are some pitfalls that parents can or should avoid when attempting to create an identity-affirming home environment?
Sure. And I feel as if my co-panelist Heather kind of hit on some of the things, right? Especially that being, her experience. But definitely operating in the family as if there's no racial differences and not talking about it, right? And so those are things that we definitely want to avoid. Acting as if like, okay, well, we are all the same here, or we love each other, so that, we don't need to talk about it, isn't going to be helpful for your child as well as their or affirming their identities. And to say that you support your child's identity being different from yours is not enough. It's not enough just to verbally state it, but how do you show that in your actions, right? Like, and even in your nonverbals, how do you show that? Because kids make a lot of sense out of things without words being spoken, right? And so they are watching to see how you interact with people who look like them, right? Like out in public settings, how are you interacting? And it tells them maybe how you might feel about someone who looks like them. And regardless of whether or not that what they interpret from that interaction is true or not, without you being able to acknowledge it and to talk about it, you allow your child to develop that understanding on their own, because children do make sense of the worlds around them, right? And so that's one of the things that, we recognize where parents might have some pitfalls there of just feeling as if their children might be too young to talk about it, or that they might not understand. And then also recognizing that as parents, while we feel like we know what's best for our children, you don't get to necessarily decide what is best for their racial identity development, right? And so not trying to control that narrative or not trying to develop it in a way that you think it's healthy, but recognizing that like, okay, you know, there might be some things that you don't necessarily understand. And again, this is where like seeking help or stepping aside might come into play. And also not, you know, Heather had mentioned like kind of like this idea of not one size fits all for, you know, children, even children in the same family, even siblings being transracially adopted together. Children are different. One child may want to talk, one may not. Right. And so recognizing that a child may not even have the words to express things about their identities that they're starting to recognize, or they may not have the comfort to express it. And so feeling as if, you know, because your child isn't talking about it, that it's not something that it's on their mind, isn't necessarily true. It just may be either one, that they're trying to figure out the way to talk about it, they're building trust, or they may not have the words to express it just yet. And so recognizing this, and also recognizing if you're pushing, right? Like I've seen parents who have pushed a bit, and that's led to some irritability and some frustration for their child or their teen. And from that, that is making that white parent as the center of that child's like identity development process. And so again, like recognizing that that process is not about you as the parent, but it is about the child. And so that kind of goes at that child's pace, right? Of like how far along they are with their like, you know, with their identities, where they are with reconciling like who they are and how that's different from the home that they're being raised in, and not trying to force that as the parent, trying to force the conversations around it, or not feeling as if the irritability or the frustration that you may receive in those conversations is necessarily that necessarily has anything to do with who you are. Or what your values are, but allowing your child to kind of take that time to figure out their own identities and their values. Yeah, and just recognizing like, you know, that your child just may not have built that comfort. They may, you know, and if they are not, if they haven't, that it's okay. But I do think that, again, like allowing your child, kind of meeting them where they are, allowing them to go at their own like pace, still allow, you know, if they, creating the opportunities as well for them to be able to have interactions and encounters with people who like identify the same way that they do. I love what Brooke stated about like living in a neighborhood where they have like that sort of access, right? So maybe that means that they don't necessarily have to go to their parent to say, hey, I need to speak with someone about this, but they may have a neighbor that they can do that with. And so again, as a parent, not feeling as if your position as their parent is threatened because your child needs to speak with someone else or needs to talk with someone.
Thank you for that, Dr. Williams. I really appreciate that, you know, you said about decentering themselves, right? Right, like the parent decentering themselves. The parent decentering themselves and, you know, bringing the child to the center, or like you said, meeting them where they are, and allowing them to come to you, because, you know, kids are all different, and they are going to express themselves all differently, and you know what we had heard earlier, you know, about it being also a trauma-filled situation where, you know, we need to let them process somewhat on their own and be there to guide them. You know, it's not completely fend for yourself, but, you know, definitely be there as a guide, as a support for them. So yes, and one of the other things that Dr. Bullock had actually even put in the chat was, you know, they're paying attention to how you treat other people of their racial identity, right? Like that is so important. You know, kids are constantly always watching what we're doing in general, whether you're a parent or a teacher or other caregiver, right? So we need to be making sure and being intentional about how we're treating others, you know, in life at all, right? We're going to go ahead and go to our next question. So Heather, stemming from Dr. Williams' response, from your perspective, kind of, and branching off of some of the things you've already told us, what do you want white folks to know when they are considering adopting, and or if they're already the parents of non-white children? So just kind of elaborating on some of the things you've said already.
Sure. I think some things that I would want parents to think about, especially if you're considering adopting, is you have a lot of research to do. And that can look different depending on the circumstance of the adoption. But just really researching the culture that your child is coming from or came from, and having that be very familiar to you. Again, without co-opting that identity, but realizing that, if you're talking about that culture and you're like, I have to look up where on the map you're from and things like that, like kids know that, kids remember that. So doing a lot of research. Also just kind of remembering that is your whiteness is going to offer your child a certain degree of protection from racism, but it's not going to extend everywhere and forever. So preparing your child for experiences with racism is something that you're going to have to encounter. And we know that through the work of We Are, that talking to kids early about race and racism does work, and this is critical. So having those conversations, like I remember as an adult, a couple times, people have used racial slurs that I didn't even realize were like racial slurs, because I don't think my parents knew that they were racial slurs. So these were like at protests, and someone would call me something, and then my friends would get more offended. I'm like, what does that mean? And they tell me, and I'm like, oh, well, I didn't know. I've never heard that before, which is, I guess fine, but I wasn't prepared. I was never taught those terms growing up. I just experienced them when they happened. So I think for white parents to understand the different types of racism that will manifest in your child's life, depending on their identity, where they're from, will really help preparing for just the life experiences that are inevitable. I would also say that you're going to have to be prepared to experience racism in people that you've never seen it coming from necessarily, and in places. And when you're adopting a child, it's your child. So you're going to have to be prepared to break friendships and even break relationships with family if they are racist, because that is going to do harm to your child. And you need to be your child's ally, defender. You're their parent. And so you're going to find that your friends who you didn't consider racist are going to say things that are not okay. And if they can't really check themselves and do the work, keeping them in your life and around your children is not healthy. And I would say that happens with family members, unfortunately. And parents have had to cut off, I think, ties with close family because of racist beliefs and comments that maybe they were unaware of before. I would also suggest not lying to your child, not keeping secrets. Of course, talking about adoption as age appropriate, but not lying about the circumstances of where they came from or about their birth parents. I know for a lot of transracial adoptees from other countries, especially my age, a lot of us came with fake stories that we're only uncovering now as adults, because we have more communication and more just resources and tools to kind of do our own searches. But a lot of us came with cover stories that our parents then, of course, told us, which were also, they were just repeating, but it's just a lot of us felt like we were raised with lots of lies and deception. And so to the extent that you can share what you have, what information you have, I think I would definitely encourage that. So I think, I think I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Heather, for all that vulnerability and for sharing those things with us. Right. And I just think about, those lies add so much more to the trauma that can be experienced by the children's situation, how you deal with that, right? So yeah, so definitely making sure that you're doing your research, and no, not lying to your children, not lying to where they've come from and who they are as people. And definitely the other thing that you said that resonated, and I'm sure resonated with quite a few folks, was, prepare for experiencing that racism from people you didn't expect, right? Like, I think that will kind of live in my brain for a little while, right? Like, it's something that you understand and but then when you're it's definitely something that you need to kind of face head on with your child, right? So thank you so much for those comments. With all this discussion around how to embody an identity affirming household and avoiding the pitfalls, there sometimes can be created, and some of you have said it already, created the well-meaning yet still harmful behavior of white parents towards their children of color. Now, some of you have already highlighted some things here, but what then are some self-checks that white parents should be aware of when navigating their own white saviorism? This is a question for any.
I can jump in bravely because this is a hard one for me. This is something I work a lot with my therapist on, because there's not only, and now that on this panel, I want Dr. Williams to be my therapist. She has so much wisdom. But this one's really tricky because in addition to white saviorism of raising a Black child, there's the more general savior complex associated with foster parenting and with adoption. And foster parenting is seen as sacrificial, and to foster well, you have to desire reunification for a child that you're more in love with every day, and you should never fall in love with something that doesn't belong to you. But at the same time, this child needs to learn attachment, and so you attach, and people are always saying things to me like, you're a saint, and I could never do it, I'd get too attached. And it's all a lot. It's a lot. I do get too attached. I underestimated how immediately and fiercely I would attach to these children as soon as they come to me. And there's a part of me that was so happy when adoption was the outcome. And I felt terrible feeling that, even though I had absolutely nothing to do with the decision, that foster parents aren't involved in the case at all. But I've worked with my therapist to hold, she likes me to hold things in my hands, and I can hold in one hand that I did want him to be raised by his biological family, and hold in the other hand that I desperately wanted to raise this beautiful boy. And there was some joy at getting to do that. And because the system is so structurally racist, and the majority of children, every single one in my care, have been children of color, that saviorism is white, and we have to face that. There's certain phrases I just don't use, and that I try to call out or call in my friends and family when I hear them say it. They're so lucky. You're giving them a better life. That's two common ones. Of all the amazing things these children are, lucky is not one of them. And I'm giving them a different life. Financial security and stability don't mean better, when on the other side of that equation is something you just can't quantify, which is being raised by your biological family. So I try to keep it in context. The foster system is structurally racist and incredibly difficult to navigate. I'm a white woman, overeducated, with financial means. I'm an English speaker, I'm cisgendered, and I have trouble navigating this system. So what's it like to navigate this system as a birth parent, or as someone without those privileges? And if you're caught up in multiple systems that are structurally racist, the child welfare system, yes, but also healthcare, education, criminal justice, housing. The people are more than the condition that society forces upon them. And then to add insult to injury, my husband and I are paid more by the state every month for these children than their parents would receive if they were in their custody and maxed out all of their benefits. So it's more valuable to the taxpayer that I, a white stranger, raise these children than their parents do. So often I question if being part of this system is to be complicit in all of that. And when I frame it that way to myself, it really doesn't feel like I'm saving anyone from anything. So for me, it's, as my mom would say, I need to put on my perspectacles and just constantly check my own privilege and set down that backpack of privilege by just reframing what we're actually doing here. That might sound harsh, especially to any foster parents on here, but and with what Heather was saying about not lying to them, I'm a strong believer that their stories are their own and they deserve to know all of it, but you can't dump some of the trauma at the feet of a very young child. So you have to kind of dole it out where it's what they can handle. And so that also is a place where it gets tricky with white saviorism, because you're like, here's your story and here's some scary things that happened to you, and then we came in. So you have to be really careful with what role we play. We try to center, we were really rooting for your mom and dad, they were stuck in a bad system, they were having a tough time with this and that, and but that's another place you have to be careful, because you don't want your child to see you as the savior, because then what does that make their biological family? So I'll stop there. I could ramble on and on about this.
No, thank you. And thank you for your quote unquote ramblings, right? Like, and for being harsh and for, forcing yourself and others to sit in this reality, right? There's so much there to unpack, but I want to give our other panelists a chance to kind of jump in here with their thoughts.
Absolutely. I was looking for like the clap reaction as Brooks was speaking, because so much of that was resonating. And yeah, like immediately what I was going to say was therapy. So I recognize that I am biased as a clinical psychologist, but yeah, I do believe that any parent in this process, as well as any transracially adopted child, should be in therapy, because there are things that just need to be processed. There's trauma there, right? And so for the parent, that white parent, recognizing to be in therapy, and not with a therapist who's going to praise what you're doing, right? Not a therapist who's going to make you feel good about yourself, but a therapist who's going to challenge some of the notions of white supremacy that you may be upholding in how you present as a parent. As someone who's going to call you out, right? Like, or call you in, or help you to think about things a bit more critically of how they may be impacting your child, so that you can, in your own free time outside of the 45 minutes to an hour that you spend with your therapist a week, can start to do some of those self-checks on white saviorism. And then again, I mentioned earlier, decentering yourself. If you're thinking that some of the things that you have taught your child, or some of the things that you all talk about, should always be the center of their universe, then, maybe you need to take a step back and recognize why that is, right? Like, thinking about the purpose and your purpose behind like the saviorism, especially if you're wanting to feel appreciated, by, and when I say appreciated, not just like thank you, but if you're wanting your child to acknowledge what you have done for them, or where they are currently versus where they, what they may have come through, what they may have gone through. I'm especially thinking about families that I've encountered where the children maybe have been removed from their biological parents, or their both birth parents, recognizing that trauma, and then those parents feeling like as if like, okay, well, this child is a teenager and they're not appreciative, or they're not recognizing how, basically lucky they are to be like in a better situation. And I think that requires just some challenges for yourself as a parent, of recognizing, okay, well, why are you doing this? Why are you in, why are you fostering this child, or why have you adopted this child, if that is what your expectation is, right? As a parent. And if you're uncomfortable recognizing okay, there's a reason that you're uncomfortable, and you might need to sit with that. That might be a perfect time to like check yourself on your own saviorism. If you're uncomfortable around certain subjects and around talking about certain things with your child, and recognizing how it might impact your child, right? Like, especially the messages that you're sending them about like who you are and what their relationship should be with you, as well as what their relationship should be with like maybe their like, you know, birth family, if there's any contact there, or what type of messages you're sending about the attitudes that they should have and the beliefs that they should have towards their own their birth families. I think those self checks can definitely come whenever you have some assistance in the beginning, maybe with the therapist, but like even being able to do those by questioning yourself whenever there's a moment of discomfort, or thinking about some of the purposes behind some of your own behaviors and some of your own like practices, right? Like if something doesn't settle well with like your child, you might take a step back to take a moment to think about, why is that? Right? Like just because that's the way you've done things, or even if it's gone over well before, you know, I'm thinking about like maybe certain traditions, holidays, or like things that people say, right? Like maybe if your family has not had an issue with touching your Black child's hair before, but all of a sudden your Black child feels a way about it, taking a moment to take a step back and think about that, right? Instead of saying it's okay to your child and encouraging them to be okay with it, but taking a moment to check yourself and think about, okay, like how can I show up in this moment for my child, right? And not in a way that necessarily like saves them and then I'm put on the pedestal, but in a way that is genuine for them and decenters me.
Thank you so much for all of that. I want to uplift what you said before. I'm a big advocate of therapy, right? Seeking that help when, you know, you don't know how, right? I'm sitting here and I'm remembering that I'm the moderator and not just another attendee, right? Listening to the awe-inspiring words that y'all are given. So thank you so much for all of those. And we're getting lots of great questions from our audience. So please feel free to continue putting those questions in the chat. Many of our questions so far have been focused on the larger picture, the zoomed out, if you will. So we like to shift, and some of you have already brought us into a zooming in, right, in terms of your own personal experiences, and I thank you for that. But we're going to zoom in and ground ourselves in, oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Heather, do you have any thoughts here?
Oh, I don't have that much more to add. I think what Dr. Williams said and Brooke said, just amazing to hear. I would add that, you know, you should be prepared probably for your kids to ask just flat out questions really earlier than you might expect. Your kids will want to know, why did you adopt me? And that's just a very honest question. And the way you respond is going to make a big difference in how they see your relationship. You know, I know that sounds like there's a lot of pressure, but if you tell your kids that you know, they're lucky, that they should be appreciative that you saved them, like they can see through that. They'll know that, and that will stick with them for a long time. And that is an incredibly harmful statement to make. To also treat your child like a project, right? And obviously that's more in the unhealthy family realm, but there are a lot of adoptees, especially I think international adoptees who are coming from countries where there was conflict, or kids coming from other circumstances. But a lot of parents do have that narrative that, you know, they saved their child and the kid should be appreciative. So I would expect that question very early, like, why did you adopt me? And other hard questions, and really think through how you want to respond. The only other thing I would add is, as I said previously, do your research, but I would also encourage you not to overdo it in terms of being like the expert then on your child's culture, and then flooding them with more than they're ready for or interested in. You want to be resourceful and to be knowledgeable, but if you overdo it, I think that can also rebound. And, you know, the response may be to reject that culture then if it feels like it's being shoved down their throat. So.
Oh, yes, thank you. Excellent points there that you've made. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. So I did get started on that. So I do apologize for jumping around a little bit. But we want to kind of zoom in somewhat and do a little bit more inward reflection, which, like I said before, you all have gotten us there already with that inward reflection, and that this work isn't work that other people are doing, and I put those in air quotes. You can't see me doing them though. It's not work that other people are doing or should be doing. It is important work that each of us needs to sit with and process. So that being said, Brooks, was there ever a time when you caused racial harm as a parent? And how did you reconcile that situation with your child, or what did you learn from that incident?
This was such a hard question, but yeah, the first thing that came to mind was when the pandemic started, and I dutifully take him to the barber every 3 weeks, and I sure did try to give that kid a fade in my bathroom, and it was not very good. So that was one incident, but I'll call out pandemic as my excuse for that, and it grew out fine. But the one that really I still feel so bad about is when he first came to live with us, that's our adopted son. He was 5. It was 2 weeks before kindergarten started, and my firm didn't yet offer parental leave for foster care. They do now. And I was desperate to find a camp that would take him for those 2 weeks. And I found one. And we all know you register for summer camps months in advance. And he kept running away. And in retrospect, and I just kept sending him back. And in retrospect, I should have taken those 2 weeks off and bonded with my son rather than putting him in a camp full of people who not only didn't look like him, but didn't reflect anything of his life experience so far. He was the only Black child in the camp. He was adapting to so many changes already and had experienced so much trauma. And I just really screwed up. And I've thought about that as harm to him, but it took a long time to really see that it was racial harm to him. Since then, I've become much better at finding diverse summer and school break care for my children, and letting them help me know where they want to go and spend their time. But making excuses for myself or saying I did better doesn't change that I really screwed up.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know it's a tough question, sure, but it's a question that many white parents of children of color can sit with and reflect in, right? So thinking about, and I'll reiterate that question, right? So was there ever a time when you caused racial harm as a parent? How did you reconcile that situation with your child? Or what did you learn from that incident, right? As a parent, it's already uncomfortable enough to force yourself to be aware of the times you've messed up. I'm included in that. And it can be even more daunting to add the layer of racial harm onto that reflection as well. But we need to consider whose pain we're prioritizing when you don't think about the racial harm you've caused your own children, that you're saying that you're bringing into your home, that you are, protecting, right? So we are beings of self-preservation, but it should not be at the cost of the pain of our children, whether they are our own biological children or not. We must always prioritize the pain of our children, especially when the parent is the one causing the harm. So being able to own up to that, being able to, work through it, being able to say, yeah, I messed up and, I am doing better, but, that was a point I did mess up. I'm not going to make excuses for that, like you said. So thank you for that. Brooks, as a continuation of your story, so what are steps that you're actively taking to hold yourself accountable? And you kind of said this already with finding the summer camps that in the summer care, but what steps are you taking to hold yourself accountable as a foster parent to non-white children? And what would you want parents to be constantly reflective about before or while they're parenting non-white children?
I try to constantly educate myself, read books, listen to podcasts, attend events like this one when I'm usually not the panelist. I'm a member of an online community for non-Black parents of Black and Black biracial children, helping us parent across racial differences. And I've learned a lot from being part of that group. I think white parents of Black children need to recognize that our position of cultural dominance can keep us from seeing our children, because we're seeing everything through our own racial lens. So we need to see and name whiteness in order to understand the contours of white culture, and then consciously decenter that to center our child's experience. I'm not sure if I explained that right, but that's something we've been working on in the group I'm part of. I'll give an example. So say my child is having an intense feeling or expressing big emotions about something. It's important for me to set aside the way I'm seeing the situation and consider things like, are there ways that my experience of this situation as a white person is different from his experience of this situation? Or have I made assumptions about my child's or other people's behaviors based on their racial identity? So kind of a stepping back so that you can see your child as a whole person and not through a white lens. So that's something I'm constantly working on. And it's tricky.
Yeah, for sure. Constantly learning, constantly being in that educative space, right? It's hard because, we want to believe that we know everything, but we don't. It's important to make sure that we're still learning and that you're still learning in that space. So thank you for continuing that education for yourself. So we are going to switch gears a little bit here, and I'm going to go ahead and get into some of the audience questions that we've been getting. We have quite a few. Hopefully we can get through quite a few. But thank you so much to our panelists so far for answering the questions that we've posed to you. We're going to go ahead and get into the audience questions now. And thank you to the audience for posing these great questions. So our first question is, where is the balance between opening the door for them to discuss their race and pushing? So where's the balance for opening the door to discuss their race and pushing them to discuss their race? So where's the balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that can be recognized based upon your child's response, right? So if you are opening the door for the conversation and your child is not readily engaging in the conversation, likely if you're continuing to bring it up, then you're probably pushing, right? If your child is showing some irritability or maybe just some frustration or some hesitation, and you're still continuing or trying to force the conversation, then you're likely pushing. If at any point the conversation feels as if your child is not a willing participant in the conversation, then it's likely that you're pushing. And again, it's one of those things where just saying that I support your identity, and I want you to have a healthy, I want to affirm who you are, your racial identity, is not enough, right? And so forcing the conversation may be more harmful than it is helpful, especially for a child who either A, isn't ready, may not have the words to articulate and express, or also just may not be willing to have the conversation with you as their parent. And that is okay, right? So that again goes to decentering yourself of feeling that you have to be that person that your child comes to talk with about who they are, and what their racial background is, their racial identity development. You don't have to necessarily be a part of that process for them. And so if there's discomfort, there's pushback, or if your child is just not really ready to have the conversation or willing, then likely you may be pushing, and it may not necessarily be as helpful as you think it is.
Thank you. Any other thoughts here? All right, thank you so much, Dr. Williams. Our next question, so I'll give a little bit of framing for this one. So I'm a Black male foster parent of transracial children. Can any of the panelists talk a little bit about how this applies to non-white parents of transracial kids? Any thoughts here?
I'll hop on this one just really quickly, and I promise to let my other panelists speak, my other co-panelists speak. I was actually crafting a response to this one in the chat, and it got so long that I felt like, okay, I could probably just wait. But I think this information does still apply for a Black parent, raising a child of a different racial background, but I do believe that there are some nuanced differences. And as I was even responding to the question, I had questions of my own, such as, if the Black parent is raising a white child, if they're raising a child from another global majority group, right? And so I was thinking about that, and like, one, okay, for a Black parent, they may be able to readily identify some cultural differences as well as some racial differences a bit more readily than a white parent that may not, either have the experience of it or may not have gotten to that point within their own racial identity development to recognize some of the nuanced differences in between like race and culture, as well as, if the parent is raising a white child, there are enough examples within our society, and there's enough that is geared toward a healthy identity for a white child, that white child, even within that Black parent's home, will still have access to resources to be able to be able to have a healthy identity development, just based upon what's out there, like resource wise, as well as if that parent is raising a child from another racial group, then this information does still apply, but it may look a little bit different, right? Like, just then, like, I believe Heather had mentioned earlier about like research, like you still want to make sure that you are knowledgeable about your child's racial background. And there's still going to be ways in which things that you don't understand, ways that your cultures are different. There still could be that, like, while it's not a white saviorism, it still may be like a saviorism complex around like, okay, well, and that's for any foster parent of like, okay, well, I brought you into my home, and this is something that we want you to be lucky, or, being able to call that out, being able to recognize difference, talk about it, right? So I think that some of these things do still apply, but they're going to look a little bit different in they're in just how they apply, right? Or where that also depends on where that Black parent is with their own racial identity development, right? And so, yeah, I think this conversation or this question requires a bit more conversation, but yes, some of these things do apply, in short, and there are some nuanced differences as a Black parent raising a child either who's white or from another racial group that they would like have to be aware of, but because of their own racial experiences might be able to readily identify some differences a bit quicker than what we might expect, or what at least I've had experience with white parents raising in transracial adoption families.
I think those situations also make space for discussions about colorism, if and when a family is ready, because that certainly is a phenomenon that can occur in biological families, even where folks have just different shades of skin color. But I think in a home with a lot of just different ethnicities or races, colorism can certainly be present and be felt. Also, I think regardless of your own racial identity, if you're adopting kids from a different culture, or even internationally, like Dr. Williams said, there's a lot of nuances. And I think there's possible mistakes. Like I'm just thinking, at least with Asian adoptions, if you adopt a Korean child and you're like, oh, let's go to Chinese food because you're Asian, like, yeah. And also not all Black kids are going to be, it's not a homogeneous group, right? And so recognizing specifically where your child came from and their unique identity and their biological family's identity, to the extent that can go a long way, instead of just kind of clumping your kid with everyone that kind of looks about like them.
Yes, definitely. Thank you both so much. Brooks, were you going to respond to that? Go ahead.
I feel like the experts had that one very well, very good, very well. I don't have any expertise in that, but enjoyed listening, but nothing to add.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, great points, excellent points from both of you. So thank you so much. Our next question is a little bit along the same lines. So do you have any advice specifically for parents of another racial or ethnic identity, in this case Latinx, on how they can include their Black child in their cultural practices while also affirming their Blackness? So you've touched on this a little bit already, but want to see if there's any other specific pieces of advice on how you can include the Black child into the cultural practices while also affirming their Blackness.
It's a tricky question because my mind goes to, oh, well, we could celebrate lots of different cultures, but then you have to be careful not to go into appropriation and start appropriating other cultures' celebrations. But I would think it would be joyful to celebrate both the family of origin or the birth family's culture as well as the adoptive family's culture. I feel like white culture is so white bread. I can't think of any cultural things that my kids that we that we do that are, you know, that are white culture. So I don't feel like my lived experience matches the question well, except for that, you know, everything they experience most in the world is white culture. But I would say celebrate.
Yeah, I agree with that. If there are, you know, definitely things that the family already does, right, that to celebrate the Latinx culture, then continuing to do that. And because you celebrate, you know, your culture and you include your child in it, it doesn't dismiss who they are, right? Like you can still continue to also celebrate things within your child's culture, and affirm their identities in that way, and even have conversations about how there are different cultural practices, right? And that, you know, you can participate, you know, in both of them and enjoy both of them. And it doesn't change who you are. And like, it doesn't change anything about like your, you know, racial identity. If anything, it just, if anything, it just allows you to affirm like, okay, this is who I am, and this is who like my family is, and I am participating in both, and I enjoy both, and that's okay. And so I think having those type of conversations and experiences, and kind of staying away from the or of it, right? Like it's kind of more of a both and, like you can do this and be Black, right? Like instead of like, oh, you know, how can we do this and not offend, you know, your who you are as a Black individual, but just more so thinking like, oh, okay, like you can celebrate both and be a part of both and be included in both, and it's still affirming.
And if your child is older, when they come to you, they might have memories of how they celebrated certain things. We always ask, like, were there any traditions that you really enjoyed around this holiday or this time of year? And then continue those on if they're happy memories.
I think those are great points. And I also want, and this wasn't in the question, I'm just popping in for a second, because I do want to speak to this because I think it's important that as we're thinking about, you know, we've definitely centered white parents adopting kids of color. And I appreciate how our attendees are showing up in their full selves as Black parents or as Latinx parents. And just wanted to say that we centered the white parent as adopting Black children because that was our lived experience in our camps. And so we wanted to speak to that point. But I did want to add to the person who posed the question as a Latinx parent who's adopted a Black child, something that would be helpful, and I think to think about, and I think Heather kind of alluded to this earlier, is the role of colorism, even in Latinx community, and thinking about how also that could impact a Black child in Latinx spaces where prioritizing certain shades over others, or gaining privileges or losing privileges based off of skin tones. And so I just wanted to uplift that to the parent who identifies as part of the Latinx community, as also, and I'm not saying that that parent has not had those thoughts, but I did want to bring that to light, that anti-Blackness moves beyond white spaces. And that I think as Latinx parents, that's something that I think should be definitely thought about when adopting, or if adopting another Black child.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bullock, for kind of rounding out that question. Heather, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to?
Oh,
sorry.
No, but actually, it reminded me sort of my family experience, where my mom's entire family is Jewish. My mom moved away from Judaism when she left for college, so we weren't raised Jewish, but we we observed Jewish holidays with my mom, with her family. And so even though that's not part of my identity, just being part of family celebrating in their own tradition became part of me, and I really appreciated that. And I know it can get tricky in different situations, but I think learning how to be with folks who are celebrating other cultures and taking part in ways that are appropriate, it just expands your awareness of the world, and your appreciation of different cultures.
Definitely. Thank you so much for all of those comments. We have a second to last question here. So what are some things as white adoptive parents, what are some things white adoptive parents can say when we encounter racist language and or behaviors that centers our children's experiences, validates their experiences, and does the least harm to our children? So what are some things we can say as white adoptive parents when we encounter racist language?
I'm going to just jump in and say that, I mean, there's so many different scenarios, right? But I would say always believe your child, right? And as a white parent, you won't necessarily always see the harm that your child has seen or named or experienced, but believing them, and not and not making them sort of justify why they feel like they were harmed, or to educate you necessarily. I think it's important. Again, they're your child, so believing the harm that was done, I think, can go a long way. And also, depending on the age, I think asking how they want you to help as well. I feel like you could go in guns ablaze and do more, maybe not more harm, but do a different type of harm if you're trying to fix a situation and your child is left to the side and you're centering your own hurt. So again, coming back to what others have said about centering your child and what they need and what they want, and making them part of that discussion.
What Heather said is something we use in my house is, do you want me to listen or give you advice, or do you need my help? That way they have a choice. That works with spouses as well. Sometimes we jump right into fixing mode, and they might really just want to be telling us something, especially as kids get older. I have to set aside my own feelings because I tend to embarrass him when I want to jump in and fix. He's less eager to have my help. So I think Heather's exactly right. Believe them. And if you hear it, if you're there, that's the situation I was imagining when the question was asked. And that's hard. I mean, I would want to go aggro on the person, like call them out, but I don't know what's best. I would love to hear Dr. Williams' thoughts on what we should do if we're out in public and we hear something racist.
Yeah, so I do agree with, just kind of taking a moment to see what it is that your child needs in that moment, right? I agree with believing your child. And so that doesn't mean questioning them in a way that feels like they're being interrogated, right, about like exactly what happened, because you don't want to you don't want to make your child feel bad for coming to share something, right? Because there is, especially with a racially motivated, racially charged incident, there's already trauma and harm that has occurred. And so to reduce some of that harm, you don't want to, at least from your part, you don't want to have them like answering so many questions that it feels as if you're not believing them. And in that moment, right, like there's a way, like you kind of might know your child, right? And you might know that if your child doesn't really like a lot of attention, then you probably don't want to kind of go in and yell or scream at another person. That's something that's going to make your child feel even more embarrassed. But if you have a child who, you know, you want to set an example for them in that moment of like how to call somebody out and like educate them in that moment with and be able to resolve the conflict, or at least walk away having advocated for your child and allowing your child to kind of be able to stand firm and knowing that like, okay, their parent is going to be able to help them in these type of situations, right? And so I don't think there's a magic line or something that you can say, because it really is going to depend upon the situation. But at least being able to advocate in that moment, to say like, you know, perhaps maybe you don't agree with that person or what they're sharing is not okay, right? Like there are ways that you can say that. And, you know, of course, also what you say is going to depend upon the child's age, right? Like you might not go into a full history lesson in front of a 5-year-old. But like perhaps maybe with your teenager, where it can be like a good moment of being able to share like, okay, well, I can handle this and I'm going to, and is there anything that you would like to add as a teen, right? So it allows them to have some agency as well without having full responsibility of like, okay, you can handle this moment, right? Or as your parent, I don't need to handle this moment. But I think that this question definitely is nuanced, and it really just depends upon the situation. And I think it depends upon what happens, whether or not it's in the moment or if it's being reported after the fact. But regardless, doing what feels the most comfortable like for your child. And even if that means like, hey, you are not addressing it in front of your child because that might cause more embarrassment for them. But let's say it's something that happened, you know, at school with the administrator, right? Like that's kind of where I think about, because that's where a lot of my childhood trauma happened, like at school with white teachers. And being the parent that goes and speaks with the teacher separately, and then letting your child know that this is something that you've handled and you've let the teacher, you know, kind of educated the teacher on your child's like background, racial identity development, or racial identity. I think that might be a way to be able to handle it. But as far as like armed, you know, phrases and things like that, I don't think there's a magic phrase or a magic word that you can say that's going to allow somebody to wake up and realize they just said something racist.
Right, definitely so true. And Dr. Bullock did put in the chat that offers a workshop titled Speak Up, Challenging Biases. We engage in role plays so that we're better prepared to respond in the moment. And again, it's one of those things like Dr. Williams said, it's not an entire list of everything you can say in every single experience and moment, but it does allow you to kind of get a little bit more comfortable with interrupting every single time something, you know, a racist situation does occur. Again, not in an overly violent way, right? You know, especially in front of your children, but in ways that say, hey, that's not okay. So definitely something to consider in terms of We Are workshops. Our very last question before we close out, because we are running low on time, is are there resources for children that might be struggling with their racial identity of being Black in a white household? I know that many of you have put, I saw a couple of resources pop up in the chat for different things, but can any of you think of specifically resources for children that might be struggling with their racial identity of being Black or Latinx or what have you in a white household?
We Are summer camp.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah.
Definitely.
My kids love it, or my kid loves it. If you're local, I don't know where you are, but the Center for Child and Family Health in Durham has a post-adoption support group for parents and for kids. They have been virtual during the pandemic, but they've got their first in-person event coming up. So I think a support group of other adopted children might help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned in the chat earlier Psychology Today as like a resource just for finding like therapists, but it's also a great resource for finding groups that might have some of the like same interests of what you may need, like, right? And so especially for folks who are not local to the North Carolina, Durham Triangle area, using Psychology Today as a resource of like, okay, what type of groups may be offered in your like, respective cities. Psychology Today would be able to kind of point you in that direction of what, is available and what's being offered.
I also want to remind parents that your kid may or may not sort of land on a racial identity when they're kids or teens, or it may go into adulthood. And as we keep saying throughout this evening, like everyone's trajectory is slightly different. And so some of the struggles may occur really early on. So the resources are going to be different. Their identities might start shifting at a later, like in their teenage years, or then when they go to college. Like for me, I didn't grow up around a lot of Asian folks. So when I went to college, that was the first time I was around other Asian people, like more than just a handful. And it was just such a different experience. And so that shifted my worldview. And then having kids with my own, that's another, significant point in my life where it's like, oh, I can't raise my kids white, because that would be my default. Because I've spent so much of my lifetime sort of identifying more as white than Asian. And the best advice my Black friends gave me is don't raise your kids white. They're biracial. Acknowledge that and so forth. And so there are going to be different points throughout your kid's life where their identities may be questioned or just solidified or up in the air. And I feel like if you're there with them, it's all the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also just wanted to state that I ran into a lot of parents that want to intellectualize this process, right? Like, and it's not one to be intellectualized, right? Like, it's not something where you're going to throw a bunch of books at your child and that's how they're going to develop their racial identity development, and or they're going to develop their racial identity and it's just going to be like a nice, like pretty picture and rainbows. Like, it's ongoing, it's ever evolving, and different experiences, as Heather mentioned, are going to continue to shape it, even up in like from early childhood through like, college, adulthood, all types of experiences. And so it's okay if you can't find the perfect book that's going to represent your family, or if you can't find the perfect resource, because your child is going to have these experiences and that's what's going to shape it. And so if I could say anything, it is not to try to like over intellectualize your child's racial identity development.
Yes, thank you so much for all those wonderful resources. And like what you said, Dr. Williams, like having it be authentic experiences that they're engaging with, right? Like, don't try and find the answer, all the answers in a book or on the internet. That's not always going to happen. Have your family have authentic experiences together. All those resources that are in the chat, as well as all the resources that our panelists just shared, will all be made available to all of our audience members. We're compiling a Google folder that we will share possibly tomorrow or the day after through an email, follow-up email. So know that you will be getting a list of all of those resources. If you haven't already written all of them down, we will have them for you. Folks and friends, we have come to the end of our time together, and I always wish we could have more, especially with topics such as this one. But like all of our work in this area, we need to accept and expect a lack of closure and know that it doesn't take one evening or one discussion to solve issues with racism and racial equity. But we must continue to be dedicated to having these conversations, being reflective, and being loving as parents and community members and caregivers, and doing the work necessary to ultimately move us forward as a community, as a state, hopefully one day as a nation. In a moment, one of my colleagues will, and I think already did, will be dropping a link into the chat for the post-panel survey. Before you depart this evening, we'd like each of you to take a moment and complete the survey, which will allow us as a team to be more thoughtful and reflective for the future in providing you all with the best content possible. We thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening. We thank our remarkable panelists for their insights and dedicated efforts to dismantling systemic racism, and for all the wonderful knowledge that they gave us this evening. So if you'd like to show your praise and do all the claps and emojis in the chat, that would be great for our panelists. So we thank you so much for being here with us. We hope that each of you as audience members take a moment to reflect on what has been said and to decide how you will show up better for your children on a daily basis, and to be advocates of change so they can exist in a world that accepts and loves them exactly for who they are. So until freedom, my friends, thank you and have a great night. Panelists, you can unmute and say your thanks and byes. And
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I really enjoyed that co-panelists, and thank you everyone for your engagement.
thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Don't forget to do the survey. Thank you, everyone.